Oh, you have returned, I see. I'm so very glad. It took me quite some time to track down the rest of this story, you know. There is such clutter up here. But have no fear. I was able to locate the next section inside the lid of Grandmother's old trunk. I might have gotten a bit carried away, and the lid doesn't quite close the way it did before. But that's to be expected when you are as vigorous as I am. Now, let us see what else this little adventure has in store for us. If you wouldn't mind, come a bit closer. I think I have a story for you.
Kissing Tulips, Part 2. The next morning I awoke late. Throwing the covers off, I bustle about getting ready. Mother had said something about tea with Lady Rosamond today, and I didn't want to displease her with another act of tardiness. I turned to Mary Ann's bed and found her still sleeping. Not wanting to get into trouble on account of my sister's laziness, I went to shake her, but stayed my hand when I noticed something odd. There were blue circles under Mary Ann's eyes, and her face was still the ghastly shade of white it had been when she had woken from her nightmare. That, coupled with the dewy, translucent look to her skin, made me pause. Cautiously, I reached out a hand to touch her forehead, then pulled back quickly. Her skin was on fire. Thoroughly alarmed now, I pulled the bell to call Martha, and she was there instantly. Bending down to inspect Mary Ann, she took one look at her and then turned back to me with grave eyes. "I must get your mother at once," she said, and hurried from the room before I could ask what was wrong. Some moments later, she returned with our mother, who bustled into the room looking harassed, but stopped when she saw the state Mary Ann was in. "What do you suggest we do, Martha?" she asked, after checking my sister's temperature for herself. "Call the doctor immediately, Mum," Martha replied without hesitation. Mother nodded curtly, then strode from the room without so much as a backwards glance. After she left, Martha turned to me. "You'd better get ready to go to tea, miss. What with the doctor having to be called and all, your mother's going to be in a right tizzy as is, and this early in the morning, too." I wanted to protest, wanting more than ever to say that I was going to stay right where I was until the doctor came and could tell us why Mary Ann looked so ill. But at Martha's sharp look, I relented. I would find out soon enough. Opening my wardrobe, I selected a mint green ensemble, which Martha quickly helped me into, and made my way down the stairs as fast as possible. Mother was at the front door, looking both annoyed and worried at the same time. When she saw me, she had immediately cast aside her look of worry and proceeded to scold me yet again for delaying. Grabbing my hand, she led me out of the house and to the carriage that waited for us, and we pulled away, leaving Mary Ann behind. As soon as we were off, I expected Mother to continue her string of complaints, but she merely stared out the window, seemingly lost in her own thoughts. I was glad for the silence. It gave me time to think. By the time we reached Lady Rosamond's home, neither Mother or I could concentrate on the social matter at hand. Led to the parlour by a stuffy butler, Lady Rosamond rose to greet us and was quick to point out the absence of Mary Ann. "Oh, yes," Mother said, a little distractedly as Lady Rosamond gestured for us to be seated. "She was unable to make it out of bed this morning. An illness has taken her, I'm afraid, and it came on quite suddenly. I left instructions with our maid to send for a doctor at once." "Dear me," said Lady Rosamond, staring at my mother with wide eyes. "I do hope it's nothing serious." "Oh, I don't think so," Mother replied, and seemed to be convinced of that at least. "A mild cold, I'm sure." And she took up her cup of tea, which Lady Rosamond handed her without further comment. I quickly stared down at the carpet to avoid Mother seeing how angry I was becoming at her complete lack of sympathy for Marianne. Furiously, I stirred my own tea and only half listened as she and my mother chatted on about this and that. At last, unable to stand the prattling of the women any longer, I politely asked to be excused and began to wander aimlessly through the house until I came to the conservatory, where I was finally able to take refuge. Strolling amongst the many exotic flowers that Lady Rosamond had collected from all over the world, I stopped at a bundle of tulips to take in their fragrance and beauty. I was preparing to leave the room when from outside the conservatory window I saw movement. A gentleman in a black suit and top hat was strolling up to the front door of Lady Rosamond's home, and my heart seemed to stop for a moment when I realized it was the Baron. What in the world was he doing here? I heard the doorbell ring and decide to stay where I was. Maybe he won't notice I was here if I just kept to the conservatory and didn't make a sound. The maid answered the door this time, and there was a sound of brief conversation before they disappeared down the corridor to the parlor. Seconds went by, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before Mother came in looking for me. Soon I heard my name being called and tried to pretend like I couldn't hear, but it was no use. Lady Rosamond had entered the conservatory, followed closely by my mother and the Baron.
"Oh, there you are, child,"
Lady Rosamond called and gestured me over to her side.
"Come here and say hello to a very dear friend of my husband's, the Baron of Westfall."
A bit reluctantly, I made my way towards the door and stopped just short of the three of them, crowded in the entrance of the conservatory. "Baron," I said politely and curtsied. "What are you doing here?"
"Lydia!"
my mother chided, but the Baron only smiled.
"It's perfectly all right, Miss Turner,"
he said.
"My calling was most unexpected, was it not, Lady Rosamond?"
"Why, yes, it was,"
Lady Rosamond replied, flushing a delicate pink as if she was 16 years old.
"But it is an honor to have you in my household, Baron. Truly it is. And I would ask your pardon. I did not realize that you were already acquainted with Mrs. Turner and her daughter."
The Baron smiled yet again.
"They were guests at the party I threw last evening, and Miss Turner was courteous enough to grace me with a dance."
"Was that you, dear?"
Lady Rosamond inquired, her small pale eyes grown as large as saucers.
"I had heard, that is to say, some of the women in my employ were certain that it was Miss Helena with whom you had danced with yesterday eve."
The Baron let slip a velvet laugh.
"You should never listen to the drivel of serving girls, Lady Rosamond. Their heads are full of fancy, and the features of beautiful girls can sometimes become confused in their silly heads."
Lady Rosamond let forth a laugh of her own, but it was not as pleasant to listen to as the Baron's. My mother joined in the guffaw as well, but I could tell that the gesture was half-hearted. Inside I knew she was far away, at home with Marianne.
"You are quite right, as always, sir,"
Lady Rosamond put in as she dabbed her face with a lace handkerchief.
"The dreaming of these young girls sometimes reminds me of how old I've become."
I repressed the urge to groan. Honestly, watching Lady Rosamond fawn over the Baron said very clearly that she did not remember how old she was, or she would have ceased the shameless flirting. The Baron, however, flashed another charming smile in her direction, then abruptly changed the subject.
"Forgive me, Lady Rosamond. I've been very rude. Allow me to inform you as to the meaning of my visit. I was passing by your house just now and remembered that I had meant to speak with your husband about an important business matter. Is he at all at home and willing to receive guests?"
"There is no need to apologize, my good sir,"
Lady Rosamond replied hastily.
"My husband is in the study on the second floor. Shall I send for him?"
"If you would be so kind."
the Baron said with a delicate incline of his head.
"And while we wait, I wonder if I might have a private word with Miss Turner. I have had a desire to speak to her ever since we danced together last evening. With her mother's permission, of course.
The last addition seemed more like an afterthought, but I could see from my mother's expression that she was going to grant him the privilege without bothering to consult me. I felt my stomach churn with uneasiness. "Come along, then, Margaret," Lady Rosamond said eagerly, taking my mother by the arm and leading her out of the conservatory. "Let us retire to the parlour, and leave these two to speak alone. In the meantime, Baron, I shall have Robert fetch my husband for you. I dare say he will be delighted to see you."
You are most kind, madam,
said the Baron, and placed a chaste kiss on the back of Lady Rosamond's hand before she and my mother exited, both tittering like schoolgirls, and closing the doors behind them. Finally alone with the Baron, I felt a chill creep up my spine, and I took several steps towards the flowers, wanting to seem engaged and not at all interested in what he had to say to me. But in reality, I really wanted to get away from his eyes. He followed me to where I stood, and I could feel his proximity as if he were pressed closely to my naked skin. I felt the urge to flinch. "What is it you wish to discuss with me, sir?" I asked evenly.
About last night.
He began, and my heart raced at the sound of his voice so close to my ear.
I feel as if I scared you away, and wanted to apologize if I frightened you.
"On the contrary," I said, and bent down to inspect the flowers. "You did not frighten me. I'm still feeling the effects of my grief is all, and I thought, well, I was sure." I trailed off. Did I really want the Baron to know what I thought I saw that night? No, it was too personal, and saying it out loud might make me sound out of my mind. I decided a change of subject was in order. "Do you know my sister is ill?" I asked, though heaven knows why I chose that topic to discuss.
I had not heard. I am very sorry to hear that. Do you know what ails her?
"No," I said, turning to face him at last, and found him standing so close to me that a mere breath would have closed our mouths in a kiss. I gasped, despite myself, and he took a step back.
Have you called a doctor?
He asked candidly, as if the last several seconds had not happened. "Yes," I replied, regaining my composure. "I expect he'll be able to tell Martha what is wrong, and will give her something that will cure my sister in no time." He smiled, but it did not look genuine. My uneasiness increased.
I'm sure he will,
he said after a pause. I stared into the Baron's eyes, and before I could stop myself, I asked, "What did you really come here for? You don't expect me to believe that you just happened to be coming to this house on the same day as my mother and me. What is it you really want?" He seemed surprised by my sudden outburst, but then something filled his eyes, an emotion I couldn't read, but it did little to settle my growing trepidation.
I can see you are a clever girl, and lying will do me no good. I appreciate a woman who can speak plainly, so I shall make myself plain to you. Even though we have only danced once and hardly know each other, I have not stopped thinking of you. If you will permit me to court you, in time, I would be honored to make you my bride.
The bottom seemed to drop out of my stomach at his words, and for a moment I was rendered speechless. "You wish to... But why? Why me?"
I should think that was quite obvious. You are beautiful, intelligent, possessed of a sparkling wit, and in you I believe I would find a companion that suits my needs in every way.
"I'm afraid I cannot accept, sir," I said, and my tone was defensive, even though I had not meant it to be.
And why is that?
He asked, seeming amused by my passion. "It's my sister, sir. We made a promise when we were young that we would not be sold off to any man. We desire nothing more than to be independent women and free from the vices of this society." He considered me for a moment, then said,
I can certainly understand your position, Miss Turner, but I promise you, as my bride, you would not be subjected to the pangs that other men's wives must suffer. I can guarantee your freedom. Can you honestly say that any other man has offered you that?
I can tell you with perfect honesty, sir, that no one else has been as generous as you have been to me just now. But as I have said before, my sister and I made a promise, and I do not intend to break it, no matter how prettily a web you spin to try and ensnare me. I expected him to be angry, but he was not. He merely took my hand and laid a kiss on the top of it before looking into my eyes once more.
I admire your diligence to remain true to your pact, and while I am a bit put out by your response, will you promise me something?
I hesitated before asking, "What would you have me promise?"
That if you change your mind, you will not hesitate to call on my house. In the meantime, I would like you to consider me your friend, and if there is anything I can ever do for you or your family, you will not hesitate to ask.
I allowed myself to smile. I promise, and I truly meant it. Later, when Mother and I were back inside our carriage and heading home, Mother chose that moment to bombard me with a plethora of questions. What did the Baron wish to speak with me about? Had he asked to court me? Was he in love with me? Was I in love with him? What had kept me so long after the Baron had taken leave of Lady Rosamond's house? I wanted to tell my mother everything that had transpired between myself and the Baron, but knew that if she found out that I had declined his proposal of marriage, she would have lamented for days. So I chose to keep the truth to myself, and told her that he had come to apologize for ruining our dance the previous evening, even though I knew that it had been my delusions that had caused us to curtail our encounter. Mother looked disappointed, but did not press me further after that. When we arrived at the house, I noticed the doctor's carriage on the street, and suddenly remembered. Mary Ann was ill, and I had spent all morning worrying about a marriage proposal. Feeling irritated with myself for having forgotten, I dashed into the house and found Dr. Carroll and my father sitting in the study, a glass of brandy in their hands and grave looks on their faces. Father noticed me standing in the doorway and strode to meet me. "How is she?" I asked before Father could say anything.
Lydia, how many times have I told you not to be so blunt with your words?
Father said, but his reprimand lacked the usual vigor that it normally carried. "Is everything all right, Father?" I ask, but it's to Dr. Carroll who answers me.
Everything is fine, Lydia. Your sister has just contracted a small case of influenza. I'm requesting that she be moved to another room until her condition improves."
"Influenza?" I hear Mother say. "I can't imagine how she could have caught that. We've been very careful to keep our girls inside when the weather starts to change. That's when sickness runs rampant, you know." Dr. Carroll smiles at my mother, but chose to ignore her comment completely and instead turned to me.
I hear you and your sister recently suffered the loss of a friend. Is that true, Miss Turner?
"Yes, Liam. He died 3 days ago. But what does that have to do with Anne getting sick?"
It's very simple.
Dr. Carroll continued, in a tone that suggested that the answer should be quite obvious.
Sometimes, when a person has suffered a loss, their body goes into a kind of shock. This shock can manifest itself in a variety of ways, such as not eating for days, listlessness, and sometimes, although the cases are very rare, brings on illnesses that they wouldn't have prior to the incident.
"With all due respect, sir," I interjected, "my sister was perfectly healthy last night, and she hasn't been listless or neglecting her food. It's true that we've had to endure a tremendous amount of incredulous gossip, but other than that, there was nothing wrong with her."
Didn't I hear you say that she had attended some sort of function?
Dr. Carroll inquired of my father, apparently deciding that I was impudent and would rather discuss the matter with a man instead of a girl.
Yes,
my father replied, but I never got to hear the end of the conversation as I turned on my heels and made my way up the stairs, ignoring my mother's remark about not stamping my feet like an elephant. Entering the spare bedroom, where I was quite certain Marianne was lying, I see that she is indeed there, laid out on the bed like a pale ghost. She looks very much the same as she did when I left her this morning. The blue circles are still under her eyes, although the wounds on her neck have been dressed and she appears to have been given a sleeping sedative. I pull a chair from the window and set it up next to her bedside, where I sit and watch her sleep. Outside, the sky begins to get dark, and soon Martha comes in to administer the medicine Dr. Carroll has prescribed for Marianne. She doesn't seem surprised to find me sitting here next to my sister's side, and I take a moment to ask her if my parents are angry with me for how I behaved to the doctor earlier. "Well, they're not exactly jumping for joy over your manners, miss, but I must say, I don't blame you one bit for acting the way you did." I look at her curiously. In all my years of knowing Martha, I have never known her to speak ill of her superiors. She caught me looking at her and seemed momentarily abashed. "You don't believe my sister has influenza, do you, Martha?" She hesitated a moment before answering. "No, miss, I don't," she said simply. "If you ask me, that doctor ought to have his head examined. I've taken care of plenty of children who come down with influenza in my time. I'm telling you, miss, it's nothing like that. Whatever your sister has caught, it's something far worse than influenza, and we can all really do is pray to God that she'll come around of her own accord." I was chilled by Martha's words, but had no time to ask her to elaborate, as she gently shooed me from the room so that she could administer the drugs to my sister. Later that night, I slept badly. Dark dreams flitted in and out of my mind, and images of death seemed to leap out at me every chance they got. And inside them all, Marianne and Liam danced like puppets pulled by a sadistic puppeteer. I awoke with a strangled scream on my lips and felt cold. The room was dark, and from somewhere in the house I could hear the wind whistling loudly outside. Getting out of bed, I threw a dress robe over myself and went to check on Marianne. The hallway was silent as I made my way down the corridor, but I was still careful not to make any noise. Mother was a light sleeper, and I did not want to wake her up. Stopping outside of Marianne's door, I turned the knob as silently as I could and pushed it open. Inside, the moon shone bright and full through the lace curtains, and there, standing before the window in nothing but her chemise, was Marianne. She did not turn as I entered the room and closed the door behind me. "Anne?" I called softly, but still she did not turn. Afraid of startling her, I crept slowly to her side, and when I saw her face, I had to fight not to cry out. She was deathly pale, and her eyes were wide open, but I could see nothing behind them. No recognition or sign that she was even looking at anything outside the window at all. Cautiously, I reached out and touched her shoulder, calling to her again. "Anne?" Nothing. "Anne!" I said, putting a bit more bite in my tone. She blinked, a long, slow blink, then turned her head a fraction of an inch to stare at me. Opening her mouth as if to speak, she stopped mid-motion, and her eyes fluttered shut. Her body swayed as if she might fall. I caught her by the arms, and it seemed to rouse her. "Liddy?" she said, as if she had just woken from a deep sleep. "Yes, Anne, it's me. I'm here. Are you all right?" "Cold," she said simply, and I felt the shiver that ran through her body. "Come on," I said, taking her by the shoulders and moving her away from the window. "You're not well enough to be out of bed yet." She said nothing, but allowed me to tuck her back into the blankets. After I was sure she wasn't going to stir from her bed again, I went back to close the window, which I realized was standing wide open. As I leaned out to grab hold of the latch to pull it shut, I noticed the street lamp outside, burning brightly against the darkness of the street below. But just to one side of it, there was a shadow, the likes of which I had never seen a street lamp cast before. It was long and rail-thin, and something about the way it stood apart from the lamp made me think that it wasn't a shadow at all, and gave me an odd feeling in the pit of my stomach. Suddenly frightened, I pulled the window shut, latching it firmly, and when I looked up again, the shadow had disappeared. We sincerely hope you have enjoyed this tale from Mary's Attic, which is written and produced by Mr. and Mrs. M. If you wish to continue the adventure, consider hitting the subscribe button along with the notification bell so you can see when we create new content. Uploads are on the third Monday of every month, with special short stories every Sunday. Have a great day, and never forget that cyanide is never meant to be taken intravenously.